The meeting room fell silent as Julian slapped the folder down on the conference table with that manufactured concern manager's practice in human resources seminars. "You are under internal investigation," he announced, his eyes sweeping across my colleagues before settling on me with unconcealed satisfaction. The entire team shifted away from me in a synchronized dance of self-preservation. 16 months of shared lunches, office jokes, and late-night deadlines evaporated in seconds. I am 48 years old, and for the past 16 months I have lived a double life. To everyone in this room I was Daniel Vance, a mid-level accountant with a quiet demeanor and a steady work ethic. In reality, I was a federal agent deeply embedded in an undercover operation to dismantle a massive financial fraud scheme. "For what exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline surge. Julian leaned forward, his smile tightening. "Unauthorized system access, data transfers during unusual hours, excessive interest in accounts outside your designated department." He ticked off each accusation with theatrical precision, enjoying his moment of perceived triumph. "Pretty serious stuff, Daniel." The team avoided eye contact. Rachel, who had borrowed my stapler just this morning with a warm smile, suddenly found her notepad utterly fascinating. Simon, who had invited me to his weekend barbecue, examined his watch as if time might stop if he stared hard enough. "We have been monitoring your activities for weeks," Julian continued, clearly relishing the power dynamic. "The evidence is substantial and undeniable." My palms dampened, not from fear but from calculation. This confrontation was happening 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Julian was accelerating the timeline, likely because he suspected I was getting too close to the core of the $94 million fraud. "I would like to see this evidence," I said, maintaining a calm exterior. "That is not how this works, Daniel. Sign this." He slid a thick document across the table. "It is a simple admission of improper conduct. We will make this discreet. You will be escorted out today with a generous severance package of $85,000. The alternative hung unspoken in the tense air. "Do not sign, and they would ruin me completely." "And if I refuse?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Julian narrowed his eyes. "Then things get less pleasant, much less pleasant. We will file criminal charges for corporate espionage." The team watched this exchange like spectators at a car crash, horrified but entirely unable to look away. These people who had praised my diligent work just yesterday now waited to see how thoroughly I would be destroyed. I reached for my phone, feeling the weight of the device in my hand. "This is not a negotiation," Julian snapped, his voice rising in panic. "You do not get to call anyone. Hand over the phone right now." I ignored his demand, dialing the secure line with deliberate calm. "Hello, is this the Federal Bureau of Investigation?" I maintained unwavering eye contact with Julian, watching his expression morph from arrogance to confusion. "Yes, this is Agent Vance. The bridge is compromised. I repeat, the bridge is compromised." Julian lunged across the table, his hand outstretched to grab my phone. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" "Code yellow at location Sunflower," I continued smoothly, dodging his desperate grasp. "Request immediate backup." Chaos erupted in the pristine conference room. Julian knocked over his expensive leather chair, scrambling around the table to reach me. 2 senior managers bolted toward the door, their faces pale with terror. The remaining team members froze in place, utter confusion replacing their earlier judgment. "He is bluffing," Julian shouted, his face reddening with uncontrollable rage. "Security! Get security up here right now!" I stood my ground, crossing my arms. "Am I bluffing, Julian?" The security guard appeared at the doorway, looking uncertain and panicked. For one heart-stopping moment, he moved toward me instead of Julian. Had my coded message failed? Was my tactical team not in position? Then came the thunderous sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. "Federal agents, everyone stay exactly where you are." Julian watched in absolute disbelief as a dozen heavily armed agents flooded the room. These were my actual colleagues, not the strangers I had pretended to work alongside for 16 long months. "This is ridiculous." Julian backed away, his hands raised defensively. "We were simply following standard procedure for employee misconduct." "Save it," said Agent Carter, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. "We have heard enough over the wire he has been wearing for the past 16 months. My colleagues stared at me, comprehension finally dawning in their wide eyes. I was not just Daniel from accounting after all. As Julian was read his Miranda rights, our eyes locked. His gaze held something I had waited a long time to see. The horrifying realization that he was not untouchable after all, and the beginning of justice for over 800 innocent people who had absolutely no idea what had been happening to their hard-earned money. But this confrontation was not the end of the operation. It was barely the beginning. The real battle was just starting, and I was fully prepared to see it through to the bitter end. The immediate aftermath was a blur of tactical precision. Julian was escorted out of the building in handcuffs, a stark contrast to the discreet exit he had planned for me. The office, usually buzzing with the mundane sounds of corporate life, was now a crime scene. Agents moved methodically, securing computers, filing cabinets, and servers. I stood in the center of it all, shedding the persona of the mild-mannered accountant and stepping back into my true identity. Rachel approached me hesitantly, her eyes darting between the armed agents and me. Daniel? I mean Agent Vance? I am so confused. I offered her a reassuring nod. You will be briefed soon, Rachel. Just cooperate with the agents and tell them everything you know. She swallowed hard, her previous warmth replaced by a palpable fear. I did not know anything, I swear. I just processed the paperwork Julian gave me. I believed her. But the investigation would have to verify every claim. In a fraud of this magnitude, $94 million siphoned away through microscopic $85 fees. Complicity was often disguised as routine administrative work. As I walked out of the building, the crisp afternoon air felt remarkably refreshing. The charade was over, but the actual work of untangling the massive web of deceit was just beginning. I knew Julian was merely a mid-level player in a much larger syndicate. The real architect of this elaborate scheme was still hiding behind layers of corporate bureaucracy and legal protections. My mission was far from accomplished. I had only just breached the outer defenses. The transition back to my life as a federal agent was jarring. For 16 months, I had meticulously crafted the persona of a man whose biggest concern was the quarterly financial reports and the occasional missing stapler. Now, I was debriefing in a sterile conference room at the bureau, surrounded by whiteboards covered in organizational charts and financial flow diagrams. Agent Carter handed me a steaming cup of terrible office coffee. You did good work out there, Vance. The wire caught everything we needed to secure Julian without a shadow of a doubt. I took a sip, the bitter taste grounding me in reality. We caught Julian, yes, but he is just the gatekeeper. We need to find out who built the architecture of this fraud. The scheme itself was a masterpiece of malicious corporate engineering. It targeted the most vulnerable clients, the elderly, immigrants with language barriers, and young adults opening their first checking accounts. The mechanism was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Automated systems would occasionally apply an $85 administrative fee to these accounts. A few days later, the fee would be reversed, but not entirely. The system would leave behind a microscopic fraction, effectively skimming a few cents off the top of every transaction. Most customers never noticed the discrepancy. Those who did were subjected to a labyrinth of customer service deflection, ultimately made to feel financially illiterate or simply confused. These tiny deductions, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of accounts over several years, accumulated into a staggering $94 million. My thoughts drifted back to the victims. I remembered an elderly woman, Mrs. Higgins, who had visited the branch in tears because her account was inexplicably short, causing her Social Security check to bounce. Julian had instructed me to tell her it was a system error that she must have overlooked. I had to deliver that lie with a sympathetic smile, knowing full well her money was financing Julian luxury vacations and executive bonuses. It was moments like those that fueled my determination during the grueling months of deep cover. The money did not just vanish. It flowed through a complex network of internal transfers before disappearing into offshore investment accounts registered to anonymous shell companies. By my third month undercover, I had confirmed the existence of the skimming algorithm. By month 8, I had identified the key internal players facilitating the transfers. By month 14, I had mapped the entire money trail leading out of the bank. The operation was meticulously planned to conclude in another month, gathering enough irrefutable evidence to ensure convictions across the board. However, Julian had moved up the timeline. A routine security audit had flagged my after-hours access to the archival servers. It was nothing conclusive, just enough to make him paranoid. Always fiercely protective of his illicit system, he decided to eliminate the potential risk by making a public example of me. He had used this tactic before, accusing employees of misconduct, forcing them to sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for severance, and escorting them out. It was the perfect strategy to remove threats while sending a chilling message to the rest of the staff. Do not ask questions. But this time, Julian had targeted a federal agent. The arrests were just the initial skirmish in a protracted legal war. The preparation for the upcoming trial consumed the next 3 months of my life. I spent countless hours in endless meetings with prosecutors, meticulously reviewing evidence and preparing my testimony. The scope of the case expanded rapidly, implicating 2 partner institutions that had knowingly facilitated the money laundering. The number of defendants ballooned to 22 individuals. I was fully back in my element as Daniel Vance, specialized investigator, yet I struggled to entirely shake off the ghost of the mild accountant. Identity is a fragile construct, and living a lie for over a year leaves residual echoes in your psyche. 6 weeks after the dramatic office raid, Carter knocked on my door with grim news. Julian has retained the services of Harrison Black, a defense attorney notorious for his exorbitant fees and his ruthless tactics in discrediting federal witnesses. They are officially claiming entrapment. My stomach tightened. Black was a legal mercenary. They filed massive motions to suppress almost everything you gathered, arguing the undercover operation lacked proper authorization and oversight. I shook my head in frustration. That is completely ridiculous. We followed every single protocol to the letter. Carter sighed heavily. Of course we did, but Black only needs to create a shadow of a doubt in the minds of the jury, and there is something else. They are digging deep into your past. They had uncovered the story of my grandparents, who had lost their entire life savings to a trusted financial advisor 2 decades ago. The devastating loss had fractured my family and driven me to pursue a career in financial law enforcement. Black was carefully constructing a narrative that my traumatic family history had created a deep-seated personal bias, leading me to manipulate evidence to satisfy a personal vendetta against financial institutions. It was a vicious attack on my professional integrity. Later that evening, as I walked to my car in the dimly lit federal parking garage, a dark sedan pulled up beside me. The passenger window rolled down to reveal Simon, my former coworker. Agent Vance, please, can we talk for a minute? Against all protocol, I approached the vehicle. I did not know about the skimming, he blurted out, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I swear to you, none of us on the floor understood the overall system. We just processed the data packets as instructed. I believe you, Simon, I said softly. But why are you here? He swallowed hard, looking around nervously. Julian called Rachel from the detention center last week. He was asking very specific questions about you. What exactly you accessed, who you spoke with during lunch breaks. My pulse quickened. What did she tell him? I do not know, Simon admitted. But there were executives from the partner firm visiting Julian right before the raid. One of them keeps calling the office, asking about server backup protocols and archive access. They are looking for a vulnerability. I thanked Simon for the critical intelligence and immediately called Carter. The syndicate was getting desperate, and desperation breeds dangerous mistakes. 2 days after my clandestine meeting with Simon, a key witness for the prosecution was found unconscious in his suburban home. The former information technology director, who had agreed to testify regarding the specific programming of the fraudulent fee system, had supposedly suffered carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty basement heater. He miraculously survived, but the incident caused severe memory impairment, completely destroying his ability to recall technical details on the stand. The local police quickly ruled it a tragic accident. The prosecution team heavily disagreed and immediately placed 3 other vulnerable witnesses under strict protective arrangements. I received enhanced security protocols myself, including a temporary relocation to a different apartment complex. They are getting increasingly desperate, Carter reassured me. During a strategy meeting, this aggressive intimidation means our core case is incredibly strong, but the seeds of doubt had firmly taken root. Our meticulous undercover operation was suddenly under relentless siege from multiple directions. Legal challenges piled up, witness intimidation escalated, and strategic media leaks constantly questioned the integrity of our investigation. The worst blow landed during the preliminary hearings. Harrison Black, Julian Ruthless defense attorney, had somehow obtained heavily redacted internal emails between my supervisor and me from the very beginning of the operation. Emails discussing my personal drive to take the case. Agent Vance, Black addressed me on the witness stand, his voice dripping with condescension. Would you confidently state that your judgment regarding this financial institution was entirely impartial and unbiased? I looked him directly in the eye. Yes, absolutely. He produced the printed emails, waving them like a victory flag. Then perhaps you can clearly explain to this court why you wrote, and I quote, "I have seen this exact pattern of abuse before. It destroyed my family. I will not let it happen to these people." The judge allowed the aggressive line of questioning despite our prosecutor's fierce objections. You created an elaborate, deceitful fiction to infiltrate this company. Black continued pacing the courtroom. You lived as a completely different person for 16 months. Is it not entirely possible that your burning desire for justice, or perhaps a deep-seated need for personal revenge, colored your interpretation of completely routine financial operations? No, I stated firmly. The financial evidence speaks for itself. Evidence you selectively gathered while operating under false pretenses, Black shot back. By the time I stepped down from the stand, the damage was catastrophic. The defense had effectively painted me as an emotionally unstable vigilante with a personal vendetta, rather than a highly trained professional following a complex paper trail. That night, sleep completely evaded me. The case was not lost, the financial records remained damning. But my personal credibility, the foundation of the undercover testimony, had been severely undermined. Someone with high-level clearance had leaked those confidential emails. My burner phone vibrated violently on the nightstand with an encrypted text from an unknown number. Parking level 3, blue sedan, 10 minutes. Come alone. Every single training protocol screamed that this was a trap, but my instincts, honed over years of fieldwork, told me this was a critical turning point. I tucked my service weapon into my jacket and took the service elevator down to the garage. The concrete structure was dimly lit and eerily silent. The specified blue sedan sat idling in a dark corner space. As I cautiously approached, the driver door slowly opened. Rachel stepped out, looking absolutely terrified. Nothing like the cheerful colleague I had worked beside. "I should not be here," she whispered frantically, her eyes constantly scanning the empty garage. "But I cannot sleep. I keep seeing the faces of those elderly clients." After the raid, I started looking much more closely at the specific accounts Julian had me process. The patterns you must have seen. She handed me a small black USB drive with trembling hands. This was scheduled to be completely destroyed during the massive system upgrade last week. It is the original programming directive for the hidden fee structure, complete with Julian personal handwritten annotations. And this, she passed over a yellow legal notepad, contains the exact dates and times of calls Julian made from the detention center. He made 3 calls to a man named Maxwell Grant at the Federal Banking Commission. The Federal Banking Commission. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Maxwell Grant was a senior regulatory official. If he was involved, it explained everything. It explained how Julian knew I was getting close, how Black got my confidential emails, and how they breached our witness protection protocols. "Why are you giving this to me now, Rachel?" I asked quietly. "Because yesterday morning someone left a photograph of my front door on my car windshield," she said, her voice cracking with raw fear. "No message, just the picture. They know where I live, Daniel. They know everything." I immediately took the materials directly to Carter. The USB drive contained the definitive proof we needed, direct evidence linking Julian to the deliberate creation of the fraudulent system. "This changes the entire landscape," Carter said, reviewing the files. "We need to secure Rachel and her family immediately." But when tactical units arrived at her suburban home an hour later, the house was completely empty. A packed suitcase was left abandoned in the hallway, and her cell phone was found smashed on the kitchen counter. Her husband told a neighbor they had received a terrifying phone call and fled instantly. The next morning, Black surprisingly withdrew several key suppression motions in the court. By the afternoon, 3 of the defendants had desperately approached our prosecution team about potential cooperation deals. "They are turning on each other," Carter noted grimly. A classic response when the mountain of evidence becomes completely overwhelming. But the victory felt hollow. Where was Rachel? And more importantly, how deep did Maxwell Grant influence really run? The atmosphere in the federal building was electric with anticipation, but a lingering sense of dread anchored my stomach. The prosecution confidence surged with every new cooperation agreement signed by the lower-level defendants. Even the presiding judge appeared increasingly skeptical of Harrison Black's theatrical defense arguments. Then, Rachel's vehicle was discovered abandoned at a desolate bus station 50 miles outside the city limits. There was no surveillance footage, no bus ticket purchased under her name, and absolutely no sign of where she had vanished. The only thing left behind was a thick stack of annotated client account statements hidden in the trunk, highlighting the precise fraudulent fee patterns. It was a goldmine of evidence for our case, but the human cost was becoming unbearable. That evening, as I pored over the newly recovered materials in my relocated safe house, the secure buzz rang violently. The tactical detail verified the visitor, a private delivery courier carrying a certified letter that required a physical signature. The plain white envelope contained a single sheet of heavy stock paper bearing a typed address in a derelict industrial park just outside the city. It listed tomorrow's date and a highly specific time, 9 o'clock in the evening. There was no signature, no explanation, just raw bait. Every single operational instinct screamed that this was a lethal trap. I immediately called Carter. "Absolutely not," he said flatly after I read him the address. "We will deploy a full surveillance team, but you are not going anywhere near that warehouse." I agreed verbally, but something about the meticulous precision of the typed note gnawed at my professional curiosity. At 8:30 the following evening, Carter called with a status update. "Surveillance reports a completely abandoned warehouse facility. There is absolutely no activity, no thermal signatures, and no signs of recent entry." At 8:45, my encrypted phone vibrated with a message from an untraceable number. "Time is running out. Maxwell knows about your family history. If he knows about my family, he had access to my deeply classified personnel files." At 9:05, against direct orders and my better judgment, I slipped out of the safe house through the service entrance, deliberately evading my assigned security detail. I took a random taxi to within 3 blocks of the industrial park, then approached the target location on foot, my service weapon drawn and ready. The massive warehouse appeared exactly as Carter had described, dark, decrepit, and seemingly devoid of any life. I slowly circled the perimeter once before approaching a rusted side door that was left slightly ajar. Inside, faint emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across an entirely empty storage floor. A single folding chair sat dead in the center of the vast space, with a manila envelope resting ominously on the seat. I meticulously swept every corner of the massive room before slowly approaching the chair. The envelope contained another USB drive and a handwritten note that read, "The offshore account connections you could not find. Run." My brain barely processed the final word when I heard the heavy mechanical click of the steel door locking shut behind me. Almost instantly, it was followed by the unmistakable, violent hiss of pressurized gas. I sprinted toward the exit, already feeling the terrifying effects of lightheadedness creeping through my body. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy steel door, but it would not budge an inch. As my consciousness began to rapidly slip away, the sharp smell of bitter almonds filled the enclosed space. Hydrogen cyanide, a highly professional, lethal method of execution. I collapsed to the concrete floor, my vision tunneling into complete darkness. I jolted back to painful consciousness, with the burning sensation of pure oxygen flooding my lungs and the deafening wail of emergency sirens piercing my ears. Paramedics hovered over me, their urgent voices echoing as if from the bottom of a deep well. "Agent down. We need immediate transport," someone shouted into a radio. My vision swam dizzily as they loaded me into the back of a waiting ambulance. I woke again in a secure hospital room, guarded by heavily armed tactical units. Carter sat in a chair by the reinforced window, his face ashen but intensely alert. "How long?" I croaked, my throat burning with every syllable. 18 hours, he replied grimly. The perimeter security team noticed an anomaly and breached the door just in time. Another 3 minutes and you would be in a morgue. He leaned forward, his expression hardening into pure resolve. "Vance, this conspiracy goes exponentially higher than Julian." The gas release was a military-grade assassination attempt triggered remotely. The doctor interrupted our conversation, checking my vitals and explaining how incredibly lucky I had been. When she finally left, Carter continued in a hushed, urgent voice. "The brazen attempt on your life triggered emergency protocols that even the director cannot override. You are being moved to a black site secure location this afternoon. A completely new identity, absolute isolation until the trial concludes." "They are winning," I whispered bitterly. "First, they discredit my testimony, then they attempt to murder me. Now they will make me disappear while the entire case slowly falls apart." "Not if we completely change the battlefield," Carter countered, handing me his personal, untraceable phone. "You have 15 minutes before the protective detail arrives to transfer you. Make them count." With only 15 minutes before my forced disappearance into witness protection, I dialed the only person who possessed the systemic knowledge required to blow the conspiracy wide open. Clara Finch, the former executive assistant to the recently deceased partner at the investment firm. Clara had quietly vanished shortly before her boss' suspicious suicide, walking away from a lucrative career without a single word of explanation. I had tracked her down to a remote cabin weeks ago, but she had refused to cooperate. Now, it was our absolute last resort. She answered on the third ring. "Agent Vance," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I heard about the warehouse they missed." "We are out of time, Clara," I said, ignoring the throbbing pain in my skull. "I am being pulled from the board completely. If you have the evidence to connect Maxwell Grant at the Federal Banking Commission to Julian fraud, you have to release it right now. Otherwise, they all walk away with $94 million, and they will never stop hunting you." The line was silent for several agonizing seconds. "I did not run because I was afraid, Daniel. I ran because I was preparing a much larger weapon. Check your secure email in exactly 2 hours. Make sure Carter is sitting right next to you." The call disconnected abruptly. I handed the phone back to Carter just as the black-suited extraction team entered the hospital room. For the next 2 excruciating weeks, I existed in a total information vacuum within a heavily fortified safe house. I had no access to the news, no updates on the trial, and no contact with the outside world. I imagined the absolute worst, our meticulous case collapsing in court, Julian smirking as he walked free, and Maxwell Grant continuing to orchestrate massive financial crimes from his powerful regulatory seat. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, my primary handler walked into the room and handed me a burner phone. 5 minutes, he instructed curtly. I answered immediately. "Carter?" I asked. "Not quite," the voice belonged to our lead federal prosecutor. "But he sends his regards from the federal courthouse, where Julian and 14 co-defendants just signed massive plea deals." I was stunned into silence. "What changed?" "You did," she replied, the satisfaction evident in her voice. "Or rather, Clara Finch did. 2 hours after you were evacuated to the safe house, every single board member, senior executive, and major investor at the partner institutions received a heavily encrypted video file. Along with the video was a massive data dump of the regulatory backups from 8 years ago, proving definitively that Maxwell Grant had personally authored the fraudulent fee algorithm before taking his position at the Banking Commission. Clara had secretly copied his original design specifications, complete with his signature, before she vanished. The video circulated like a raging wildfire. Once the board members realized they were being set up to take the fall for a massive federal corruption scandal, they panicked entirely. 3 independent directors came forward, offering undeniable evidence in exchange for leniency. Julian and his executive team, realizing they were being sacrificed to protect Maxwell Grant, quickly followed suit. Grant attempted to flee the jurisdiction on a private jet, but was apprehended by heavily armed agents on the tarmac. He is currently facing severe federal corruption charges, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder. 2 months later, I stood quietly in the back of a crowded federal courtroom as Maxwell Grant received a lengthy 30-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Julian and his associates had already been sentenced to extensive terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. However, the ultimate victory occurred after the sentencing, when the presiding judge officially announced the creation of a massive restitution fund for the victims. Over 1,200 hardworking people would finally recover the money that had been systematically stolen from them. As the courtroom slowly emptied, I approached the prosecution table. "There is still one thing I do not understand," I told the prosecutor. "How did Clara know exactly how to trigger the legal failsafe?" She smiled warmly. "She utilized the Elder Financial Abuse Statutes under the Welfare and Institutions Codes, Section 15610. By proving that the algorithm specifically targeted the accounts of elderly clients to illegally dissipate their assets, the fraud escalated from simple corporate theft to a massive civil and criminal rights violation. It pierced the corporate veil instantly. The system Maxwell Grant had meticulously built to protect himself had ultimately become his catastrophic undoing. Outside the majestic courthouse, the crisp afternoon air felt remarkably clean. The corrupt syndicate was completely dismantled, its illegitimate assets forcefully seized and transferred back to the verified victims. My pursuit of justice was never about the dramatic destruction of individuals. It was about the fundamental transformation of a corrupt system that had enabled powerful predators for decades. The greatest satisfaction came weeks later, when I personally delivered the very first restitution check to Mrs. Higgins, watching her initial disbelief transform into tears of profound relief. Julian, Maxwell, and their arrogant associates had lost absolutely everything: their vast wealth, their freedom, and their pristine reputations. More importantly, they permanently lost their power to harm innocent people. They would spend the next several decades in concrete cells, forced to contemplate how thoroughly they had been dismantled. Not by a dramatic shootout, but by quiet, meticulous, and unrelenting justice.